Hello, and welcome to History Speaks, the monthly local history program from the St. Joseph Public Library. My name is Jennifer Sanders-Tutt, and I am the local history librarian for the library. I still plan on bringing you this monthly program, even if we are solely online for a while. Next month, I thought it would be timely to discuss the influenza pandemic of 1918, which has some interesting local ties. But today's subject matter is a little bit lighter in topic. We will be talking about the Columbian Exposition of 1893. For this, I am joined by Trevor Tutt, Curator for the St. Joseph Museums. So without further ado, we will be talking about Mary Alicia Owen, Eugene Field, and the Columbian Exposition of 1893 today. We'll also be talking about a few other notable St. Joseph characters that we maybe knew a little bit about and learned more during the research of this presentation, or discovered some new people that we didn't know were involved. The Columbian Exposition of 1893 was a World's Fair. It was sought after by many cities to become the host city, but especially Chicago. It was important to Chicago to host because they wanted to show that they had come back from the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 that had devastated the city. And this was also a chance to showcase the technological and industrial advancements within the city. And this was, of course, during the Gilded Age and the Second Industrial Revolution. So there was a lot of money in Chicago at the time. The city was laid out and designed by John Wellborn Root, Daniel Burnham, Frederick Law Olmsted, and Charles B. Atwood, and they were notable architects and city designers of the time. And they laid this out to be a prototype of what they thought the ideal city should be. And they designed it in the Beaux Arts style, with French neoclassical architecture. And if you've ever been to the downtown St. Joseph Public Library or the St. Joseph City Hall, then you're familiar with Beaux Arts style. Edmund Eckel, who was a notable architect in his own right, but certainly probably the most notable architect within St. Joseph, was trained and designed in the Beaux Arts style. So as you go around and look at the architecture in St. Joseph, you will see many works in that style because of him. And Beaux Arts style was based on principles of symmetry, balance, and splendor, and this would become a known feature showcased in the Columbian Exposition. Another notable architectural feature that was used in the construction of the buildings at the Columbian Exposition was white facades. All of the buildings were white in this city, and as such, it became known as the White City. And there were over 200 buildings, and this spanned an area of about 690 acres. And this exposition, this World's Fair, was supposed to be a spectacle of art, science, and industry. Look how far we've come throughout the history of humanity and how many advancements we've made. The fair opened on May 1st, 1893, and lasted for about 6 months before closing at the end of October. They actually had a big party to close it out on October 31st. Over the course of the 6 months, more than 27 million people attended from all over the world, and especially from here at home in St. Joseph, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. Here you'll see an image from the opening day of the fair on May 1st. Certainly a lot of people attended. I mentioned that this was during the Gilded Age when the exposition went on. And as such, there was a lot of money had by a lot of industrialists. And many of these industrialists very much wanted this fair to happen. So they sunk a lot of their own money into it and did a lot of fundraising. All in all, $1.5 million was spent to construct this city. In today's money, that's about $41.8 million, so certainly a large financial endeavor. But that's because they knew it would bring a lot of people into the city, so it would be an economic boon to the city of Chicago. One of the features that was very important from the time of the inception of this new Columbian Exposition was that it would be completely electric. It would be lit up in the evening, and there would be various other electric features showcased in the fair. This is also the time of Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla and their war for electricity and the light bulb. Thomas Edison had GE, General Electric, and Nikola Tesla was with Westinghouse. And it was between those two companies that a bidding war took place to be the ones to electrify the Columbian Exposition. At the same time, there was also a patent war going on with the particular type of incandescent bulb that they both wanted to use. That patent ended up going to Thomas Edison and GE, and so Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla found themselves not being able to use that at all. So initially, Edison and GE were the ones to win the bid to electrify the fair. They bid it at $1.7 million. Just a minute ago, I mentioned that they spent a total of $1.5 million on the fair total. So they went back to a bidding war to try and get that price down. And it was Westinghouse that ended up bidding the lower number and actually underbid themselves. And that created a lot of problems for them later on. Because Edison had won the patent for the incandescent bulb, Westinghouse had to find an alternative. The alternative worked well. It burned bright. However, it burnt out at a very rapid rate. So you had a beautifully lit fairground, but you would see teams of people going through and changing out light bulbs continuously. And because of that, Westinghouse had already underbid itself, so they lost a little bit of money, but they hadn't really factored in that the light bulbs would burn out at such a high rate. And so they kept having to produce light bulbs, and that was another added expense that they hadn't counted on. As a result of Westinghouse winning the bid to electrify the fair, Nikola Tesla got to have an exhibit within the fair. And here you'll see a slide showing a photo of his polyphase alternating current exhibit. So now we'll take a momentary detour from the events of the exhibition proper to talk about kind of a notorious figure that has become associated with the Columbian Exposition, H.H. Holmes. And if you're a true crime buff, the name probably sounds familiar to you. It was Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. He was actually born Herman Webster Mudgett, which is quite a name. And he eventually attended Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, where he studied under a notable doctor who was working on anatomy and dissection. And so he became familiar with this during that time. He graduated in 1884 and traveled around the country from job to job in different towns. However, wherever he went, mysterious deaths occurred and seemed to follow him. And so he wouldn't stay in one place very long before the local townspeople would kind of get suspicious and he would have to move on. He began using the name H.H. Holmes when he arrived in Chicago in 1886. He ended up getting a job at a drugstore and dry goods store there. It was owned by a couple. There have been several apocryphal stories that surrounded his relationship with this couple and whether he murdered them or what happened to them. I think some of those have been debunked throughout the years. But he did well at this store, and he ended up purchasing it from them. He also purchased the lot across the street where he began construction on a building. Holmes was also quite the con man, and he would bring in construction companies to maybe start part of the construction or do a piece here and a piece there with no intention of paying them, or he couldn't pay them. So he did that throughout the construction of this entire structure. It ended up being 3 stories, including a basement. And according to him, it was his intent that it become a hotel called the World's Fair Hotel for the Columbian Exposition. However, this never opened. But the stories that came out of this building were that it was a maze, it was a labyrinth, that there were hallways that led to false doors that would drop off, there were soundproof rooms, there were trapdoors that would drop out from underneath you. Very scary stuff. And it was here that this essentially became what would be called his murder palace, where, according to him, he would commit at least 27 murders. He ended up confessing to those later on. The authorities could only ever confirm that there were 9 murders. But it wasn't actually the murders that got him in trouble, that got him arrested. It was insurance fraud. And that seemed to be murder seemed to be the means to the end for insurance fraud, because he was interested in the money. And it was for that reason that he was actually finally apprehended. And in 1896, he was put to death by hanging. But if you're interested in this story, because there's a lot of information to it, I highly recommend Erik Larson's book, Devil in the White City. It's an excellent look at the impact and the kind of stir that was caused by him during the Columbian Exposition. So that's a little bit of history on the Columbian Exposition itself. Now I'm going to turn it over to Trevor Tutt, who is going to talk about the St. Joseph connection to the Columbian Exposition.
As Jennifer mentioned, the World's Fair was an opportunity for the United States to show off inventions that they had created over the years, and so several inventions were debuted at the fair. Those include shredded wheat, Pabst Blue Ribbon, Ferris wheels, the dishwasher, and a moving walkway. Hershey's chocolate also became extremely popular during the World's Fair, as did the Aunt Jemima pancake batter mixture, which was founded here in St. Joseph. Back in 1888, Christian Ludwig Rutt and Charles Underwood purchased a flour mill here in St. Joe, and in 1889 they created what would become the Aunt Jemima pancake batter mix. They wanted to create a mixture that people could purchase and make at home, so they didn't have to mix it themselves, and so that's how it was founded. But they couldn't make a lot of money off of it right off the bat, and they ended up having to sell to Randolph Drew Davis in 1890, who founded R.T. Davis Milling Company. It was R.T. Davis who decided to use the character of Aunt Jemima to sell the flour mixture. Aunt Jemima had been around in vaudeville plays for years before this, so she was pretty well known as a character. He hired Nancy Green to portray her at the Columbian World Fair, which is where she debuted the character. She sang songs and taught people how to use the mixture and created thousands of pancakes to sell to people visiting the fair. She did this all in front of the world's largest flour barrel, which was 12 foot by 24 foot. And so that's kind of the introduction of Aunt Jemima to the American public and why it became so popular. There were several St. Joseph citizens who were involved in the World Fair. We're going to talk about a few of them today. Most of them were authors. One famous citizen was Mary Proctor. She was the daughter of astronomer Richard A. Proctor. Her mother died in 1879 while she and Professor Proctor were on tour in Australia. On that same trip, he met Sally Crowley, who was the niece of M. Jeff Thompson, the former mayor of St. Joseph and a Confederate general. Sally and her husband had traveled to Australia because of his failing health, and he ironically died a few days after Richard Proctor's wife did. So on the return trip back, Sally and Richard became very close friends, and they were married in 1881. They set off on a world tour after their marriage, and they returned to St. Joseph with their children to make it their permanent home in 1884. So that's how Mary Proctor came to St. Joe. Richard Proctor died in 1888 of the yellow fever. So Mary followed in his footsteps, writing about astronomy using the stories he told her during her youth and his extensive library to educate herself. Mary was placed in charge of several aspects of the World's Fair. She was in charge of developing souvenirs for the St. Joseph Room that was in the Missouri building of the World's Fair. She was also supposed to create a book of St. Joseph authors that actually never reached completion, but she did give several presentations during the World's Fair. She read the poetry of the stars at the Congress of Women in May of 1893, and during the Children's Afternoon of the Congress of Authors in July of 1893, she presented Fable of the Stars and The Goblin's Trip to Starland. These would become the foundation of her book, Stories of Starland, which she published 2 years later in 1895. During one of Mary's speeches, the lights were out, One report says that it was a scheduled outage, but as Jennifer mentioned before, the Tesla lights burn out rather quickly, so it's possible that the lights were just burnt out and needed replacing. Um, but because of this, Mary couldn't read her notes, and so she started to tell the story on the fly, which became her standard method for the rest of her career. She just started memorizing everything, and she would give her speeches across the United States um, just by memory. She used a number of glass slides to illustrate her speeches, which we'll show you here in a moment. After the World's Fair, she was living in New York City, and she took off on a nationwide tour, which she continued for the rest of her life, just traveling and giving speeches about astronomy and children's stories. She was also very upset with the manner in which her father's grave was handled. So she gave a speech at the World's Fair to the international astronomers and inviting them to the rededication of her father's new tomb in Brooklyn at Greenwood Cemetery to kind of give him a more proper burial spot with funds that she raised herself. Another prominent St. Joseph citizen who presented at the World's Fair was Mary Alicia Owen. She was a folklorist, in kind of a apocryphal story that I don't have citations for right now, but I'd like to find them. It said that Luella Owen, Mary Alicia's sister, studied astronomy under Professor Richard Proctor, and it's said that his daughter Olivia Proctor gave Mary Alicia her first copy of the book Algonquin Legends of New England, which was written by folklorist Charles Godfrey Leland. We do know that Mary Alicia and Leland started a correspondence in the 1880s, so it's possible the story is true, but we can't find any record of who Olivia Proctor is, or whether she may or may not have just been Mary Proctor, who we spoke about earlier. But regardless, Mary Alicia started to study folklore and write Charles Leland extensively. And throughout the late 1880s and early 1890s, she was studying voodoo. Mary Alicia Owen was raised by slaves. She was born in 1850, and so she was told stories as a child growing up of nature worship and the practice which became known as voodoo. And so she continued that study through her adult life and collected those stories and presented them. She presented, or Leland presented her work known as Among the Voodoo, which was a paper that she had written at the Second International Folklore Congress in London in 1891. And so she traveled to Chicago in 1893 to present an updated version of that paper called Voodooism at the Third International Folklore Congress at the World's Fair. It was from this work that she published her first book called Old Rabbit, the Voodoo, and Other Sorcerers. We have a copy of that at the museum, and I believe they have a copy at the library as well that you can read. So that was kind of the beginning of Mary Alicia's career, was due to her exposure at the World Fair.
The third St. Joseph citizen that we'll discuss today is Eugene Field, very notable author and poet. We even have a sculpture of his little boy Blue in the lobby of the downtown St. Joseph Public Library. Eugene Field, at this time during the Columbian Exposition, was actually living and working in Chicago, but he got his start in St. Louis. He was born there and raised for a little while until his mother died, at which point he was sent to live with his cousin in Massachusetts. His father was a prominent lawyer and remained in St. Louis, but when Eugene Field was about 18, his father passed away, leaving him his entire estate. Eugene Field would go on to famously and self-referentially talk about how he didn't have a head for money, and so would later turn it over to his wife. But as an 18-year-old, he decided when he got his father's estate that he was going to go on a trip to Europe. And he decided to take his good friend, Edgar Comstock. And before they left, Edgar had said, "Why don't you come home with me to St. Joseph for a couple of weeks and stay, meet my family, and all that?" And so upon arrival, Eugene Field almost immediately fell in love with Edgar's younger sister, Julia Comstock. The Comstocks, I believe, had 3 daughters, and it was reported that they were all extremely beautiful, like each more beautiful than the last kind of thing. And so Eugene Field fell in love with Julia. Now, Julia was quite young at this point. There was a pretty substantial age gap. And there's a famous story, apocryphal or not, I'm not sure, of Eugene Field going to Julia's father and asking for her hand in marriage. And when her father says, she's not of age yet, Eugene Field famously put back, well, she'll grow out of that. So it is what it is, but they would go on to be married much later. And in fact, when they were getting ready to leave for this trip to Europe, he and Edgar, he left Edgar at the station waiting. And so Edgar's wondering where he is. Eugene Field had gone back to St. Joseph to see Julia again before leaving. And so they ended up postponing their trip for a while. And then on this trip, he went through a sizable portion of his father's inheritance. And so it was then he realized that he wasn't any good with money, and he wanted to marry Julia Comstock. And so he came back to St. Joseph and settled, working at the St. Joseph Gazette, one of the newspapers in town at that time. And at the Gazette, he wore many hats, did many different jobs, and he quickly rose to editor. But he was still doing a lot of different aspects of the job, even while he was editor. Eventually, Field would leave St. Joseph and go to work and live in Chicago. And it was during the Columbian Exposition that he was there. And there was a newspaper article, or rather a little snippet in the newspaper that I found, him writing back to St. Joseph to tell reporters here not to come out there expecting to find work because there wasn't any. So Chicago was such a bustling city at that time that there were no reporter jobs. But it was during this time that he was invited to speak as part of the Literary Congress. And he presented his poem, The Telling of the Bees. And it's a really beautiful poem. But he talks about the English tradition of the telling of the bees. And this essentially is that bees are such an integral part of like a farmer's life or country life there, that an individual would tell its hive of bees everything that happened in its life. So any big occasion, any loss of a family member, any birth of a new family member, that integrated the bees. They were kind of the watchers of a family. And it's a very beautiful story. And it was after he read this poem that's maybe most notable for our intents and purposes in St. Joseph's connection to the exposition, that Eugene Field gives a short little speech about the impact on female folklorists and his writing. He says, "It is to a woman that we are indebted for the only compilation of the West Indian folk tales, to woman for several delightful volumes on the ancient charms and the old legends of the Irish, to a woman for our acquaintance with the myths, symbols, and magic of the East Africans, to a woman for the learned and delightful treatise upon Old Rabbit the Voodoo. In short, it is to women that we are indebted for a very large share of the curious, entertaining, and instructive literature in which all people as intelligent and enterprising as we are delight." So it's in this speech that Field makes a direct reference to Mary Alicia Owen and the impact her writing and her research and her folklore had on him. And that's very interesting because he lived here at the same time Mary Alicia lived here and was active in her writing still. Not only did Eugene Field present at the Columbian Exposition, it was also mentioned in the papers that he went a couple of times to just experience the exposition. And no doubt he made it to the Missouri building, I'm sure. So part of the exposition, each state had a specifically designed building that represented it. And within each building, each room was dedicated to a prominent city within that state. And within the Missouri building, you have a slide of the building's exterior here. There was a St. Joseph room. And in that room, there was a ledger. And everyone who came into that room, not just St. Joseph people, not just people from the rest of the country, everyone who came in that room would sign that ledger. And they actually ran out of room in the first ledger and had to get a second ledger. And those two ledgers reside at the downtown St. Joseph Public Library. And they're really fascinating to go through. Flipping through the pages, you see a lot of names that are familiar to St. Joseph's history. And you see a lot of people that were from different parts of the country and different parts of the world even. I'm sorry I don't have a slide in there of that. I thought I had one. But we're always happy to get those out when people come to request them. We hope to digitize those soon because they are just a really unique piece of St. Joseph's history, and we're very happy to be able to have those and preserve them. Well, thank you for bearing with us on this first digital history space. It's a little bit different for us as presenters recording than it is just getting up in front of you all and talking. So it's going to take a little bit of adjustment. We appreciate your patience, but if you have any questions or are just curious about anything else that we have at the Downtown Library or at the St. Joseph Museums, feel free to contact us. Our information is on this last slide here. While many of us are working from home right now, we're working very hard to bring you programming and add to our digital archives, is what my focus has been right now. But we're always happy to take questions and interact with everybody. So if you have any at all, we're always here. Everyone stay safe and stay well.